is interpretation. A poem well read is a poem well understood. In this podcast, brought to you by the Literary Life Podcast, poet Thomas Banks will help you increase your love and understanding of poetry. Each short season of weekly episodes will be connected by a particular theme or focus, and in addition to modeling good reading, Mr. Banks will introduce the poet and provide some light explication and analysis, with an emphasis on both form and meaning. Poetry is not a silent endeavor. It's meant to be heard, and more importantly, it's meant to be recited out loud. Join us now as poet Thomas Banks presents The Well-Read Poem.
Hello, and welcome to The Well-Read Poem. During these past seasons, I have mostly discussed and read poems that I genuinely admire, poems that have some variety of qualities to commend them. This time around, I thought it would be fun if we dwelt on some poems that didn't necessarily have the same obvious excellence, the same, sublime or even, kind of domestic beauty to commend them. The poems I selected for this season are bad poems. That by itself, there's nothing, really to write home about there, because probably, if we're being honest, more bad poems than good poems have been written in the history of verse. It's just a fact. If you write any verse yourself, you probably are used to turning in one that's kind of a duffer, honestly. I myself, I think when I was a teenager, must have written several hundred sonnets, and I think almost all of them, without exception, were bad. And I'm happy that those notebooks are well buried or burnt somewhere, hopefully. Pray God. But this time around, I thought it would be interesting, since, bad poetry is easy to find, if I selected great poets, acknowledged talents, in the history of the English language, but I selected their worst stuff. So, as the ancient Roman poet Horace said, sometimes even Homer nods, which means, sometimes even Homer, the greatest of classical poets, even he falls asleep at the wheel. Now, we can be depressed by that. We can hold it against Homer, or more sensibly, we can say, hey, even Homer is only human, like the rest of us mere mortals. And, thank God that he's not so perfect that his work admits of no blemishes. Maybe we should take it for encouragement. Anyhow, this first poem for this season is entitled On the Jubilee of Queen Victoria. It was written by Alfred Lord Tennyson in 1887 for the 50-year anniversary of Queen Victoria's reign on the throne of England. Now, Tennyson was poet laureate. He was probably the greatest poet laureate that is the official public poetic spokesman for the English people. It's not a fun job to have, notoriously. Poet laureates, you have to write every time Princess whatever has a new baby, you have to write an ode commending this child for virtues which it may or may not grow up to have. It's hard to be inspired when you're writing poems, sort of set to newspaper headlines. Tennyson actually did a pretty good job of it most of the time. I mean, it's as attested by, a poem like The Charge of the Light Brigade, which is maybe his most read poem today. And that poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, was actually written while he was on a railway journey. He wrote it, I think, on the back of the newspaper that he read about the charge of the brigade at Balaclava in. Anyway, so on the Jubilee of Queen Victoria, it's, on the one hand, I think he really is trying here. It's metrically experimental. He's writing in, he begins this, he kind of changes meters a few times. He begins in trochaic meter, which is not actually an easy meter to write in English. It takes the normal stress pattern of an iambic line, which is ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum ba bum. That would be a line of iambic pentameter, and it reverses the stresses, putting the stresses on the first syllable rather than the second of a foot. So the first line of this poem, 50 times the rose has flowered and faded. So 50 times the rose has flowered and faded. That's not a bad line. Anyway, so he's playing around with a meter that most English poets do not use that much because, just the natural cadences of the English tongue don't really lend themselves to it. Um, so it's a commendatory ode, and I kind of get the impression that Tennyson made a list of the achievements and qualities that Queen Victoria's reign had been noted for, and kind of just threw them in kitchen sink fashion into this poem without bothering really to carefully dispose or arrange them. Anyhow, so this poem, I think, fails for that reason. Also, another reason this poem, I think, is not Tennyson's best. It is an ode. It's his job to praise. That is one of the first jobs of a poet, to praise. Nothing wrong with that. However, I think that here, we'll see, especially at one or two points, praise turns into advertisement, and it almost sounds like Tennyson is selling a stock in the British Empire, or I don't know, patent in the British Empire or something like that. It almost seems like he's pawning wares of a certain kind. Anyhow, I don't think it quite works for that reason. It has kind of an air of false enthusiasm through the whole thing. Anyhow, nothing against Alfred Lord Tennyson. I like Tennyson a lot, but I think it's for poems like this and maybe a few others that after his death, he became very unfashionable overnight. There was kind of an inevitable reaction against him since he had been so popular during the second half of the 19th century that when the 20th century dawned, a lot of people looked at Tennyson as sort of like your grandmother's heirloom china or something like that. It's something that everyone has lying around, but nobody, really likes to acknowledge. So anyhow, Tennyson is a great poet. This does not represent him at his best. On the Jubilee of Queen Victoria by Alfred Lord Tennyson. 50 times the rose has flowered and faded, 50 times the golden harvest fallen, since our queen assumed the globe, the sceptre. She beloved for a kindliness rare in fable or history, Queen and Empress of India, crowned so long with a diadem never worn by a worthier, now with prosperous auguries comes at last to the bounteous crowning year of her jubilee. Nothing of the lawless, of the despot, nothing of the vulgar or vainglorious, all is gracious, gentle, great, and queenly. You then joyfully, all of you, set the mountain aflame tonight. Shoot your stars to the firmament, deck your houses, illuminate all your towns for a festival, and in each let a multitude loyal each to the heart of it, one full voice of allegiance, hail the fair ceremonial of this year of her jubilee. Queen, as true to womanhood as queenhood, glorying in the glories of her people, sorrowing with the sorrows of the lowest. You that wanton in affluence, spare not now to be bountiful, call your poor to regale with you, all the lowly, the destitute, make their neighborhood healthfuller. Give your gold to the hospital. Let the weary be comforted. Let the needy be banqueted. Let the maimed in his heart rejoice at this glad ceremonial and this year of her jubilee. Henry's 50 years are all in shadow. Gray with distance Edward's 50 summers, even her grandsire's 50 half forgotten. You, the patriot architect, you that shape for eternity, raise a stately memorial, make it regally gorgeous, some imperial institute, rich in symbol, in ornament, which may speak to the centuries, all the centuries after us, of this great ceremonial and this year of her jubilee. 50 years of ever-broadening commerce, 50 years of ever-brightening science, 50 years of ever-widening empire. You, the mighty, the fortunate, you, the Lord territorial, you, the Lord manufacturer, you, the hardy, laborious, patient children of Albion, you, Canadian, Indian, Australasian, African, all your hearts be in harmony, all your voices in unison, singing hail to the glorious golden year of her Jubilee. Are there thunders moaning in the distance? Are there specters moving in the darkness? Trust the hand of light will lead her people till the thunders pass, the specters vanish, and the light is victor, and the darkness dawns into the Jubilee of the ages. I think the poem, for me anyway, my judgment, I think it hits its lowest note in this ninth stanza. 50 years of ever broadening commerce, 50 years of ever brightening science. It's almost like he abandons poetry for sloganeering right there. It's like I said, it's like he's selling pills or soap or something like that. So yeah, Alfred Lord Tennyson, he had better moments, more gracious moments, less bombastic moments than this poem. And when you're as great as he is, you can afford to write the occasional bomb, which this is. Thank you all very much. I will be with you next week.
This has been The Well-Read Poem with poet Thomas Banks, brought to you by the Literary Life podcast. For show notes and the text of the poem, visit theliterary.life. To find out more about Thomas Banks and the poetry resources he offers, go to houseofhumaneletters.com. This podcast is patron supported. Visit patreon.com/theliterarylife to find out how you can support this podcast and get additional bonus content, including monthly live poetry explications. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. Thank you for listening.